I belong to a tradition of thought that believes that history is always an edited version of reality. Fighting occurs over stories, which stories are dominant, which stories are obscured, which stories are erased, which stories are revised in time for good purposes or bad purposes. The editing of narratives is a function of power. Who has the power to uphold one narrative as opposed to another narrative? Usually, these are the people who owns the dominant political power. So, the troubles in Mindanao, at least from one perspective, this is certainly my perspective, which I'd like to share with you. The troubles in Mindanao, which transpired over centuries, may be viewed as on one hand, as a contest of stories. I don't think I need to argue this here, but I think I have to push forward an idea, which is certainly not mine. Many other people who are thinking very deeply about this problem have actually been hoping that this will come to the surface, and that is that unless the indigenous peoples of Mindanao, the Muslim peoples of Mindanao, and the settlers of Mindanao agree or manage to agree on a common narrative of what transpired, particularly in the last half, the second half of the 20th century up to today, then our peace will be fragile. If there is no shared story, if the stories are not in agreement with each other or are unaligned with each other. And it seems to me that the task that was exploded into our faces by Mamasapano is precisely why are our stories not aligned with each other? Why are our stories so different from each other? So violently different from each other? And when we hear what's happening and how this is being discussed in Congress, we realize both in the House, in the Senate, in the newspapers, the mainstream of discussion is so thin. It doesn't seem to have all of the complexity of what in fact happened over the centuries. And we wonder, how did this happen? How did this happen that it is a thin line of discussion? Peace will remain vulnerable, therefore, to nefarious political actors. But really, peace will be vulnerable even to spontaneous combustion. In other words, no one is actually pushing particularly nasty narratives, but there seems to be a combustive effect or dynamic, which obviously is egged on by a few actors, but the spontaneity of the combustion seems to have its own fuel. So I speak from two perspectives. One is I've been going and studying Mindanao from various cultural studies perspectives over the last 30 years. But in particular, I've been writing a book on one town in arms over the last 4 years. And that book has allowed me to do three things. One is to think about the Ilaga terrors of the 1970s and the 1980s. And I've actually plunged deep into that set of stories, which are quite obscure by now. The second thing that it had allowed me to do is to construct a timeline from 1900, which puts together various timelines and to actually do a rather rigorous cross-checking of various timelines. The timeline that the MILF has put forth in a book, the timelines of historians, the timelines of cultural research people, and to sort of solidify these timelines. That proved to be extremely difficult work. But I think I've come out of it in the last year with a certain confidence that the timelines can be validated. Thirdly, I was able, I believe, to bring to bear my own discipline of cultural research and cultural studies to see how important for instance, in analyzing what happens, to be able to hear the difference between Iranon and Maguindanao, to be able to hear the difference between Iranon and Maranao, and to see how these various ethno-linguistic shadings are actually playing in these affairs. Again, this is a point of view and an area of research that obviously journalism, for example, cannot attend to because it's in such a rush. All right, in broad strokes, therefore, I'd simply like to enumerate things that have not been emphasized enough. And so I'm not expecting that you will pay attention to the details of my enumeration, but just as broad strokes of what I've been immersed, to use the word, immersed in. And knowledges, huge knowledges that seem to be unaccounted for in the discussions thus far. I'll give you a sense of the detail by just citing two areas that just seem lost. If you'll bear with me with just two little things that are quite big. The Philippines, for example, this is part of my timeline. In the 1940s, the Philippines received its formal independence, and the new Philippine Republic continued to pursue the primary policy goal of its predecessor in Mindanao with far greater vigor. That means the tremendous expansion of government-sponsored Christian Filipino immigration from the northern provinces to the Muslim South. Everyone seems to know that, but the demographic data is important. From a single municipality, Kapatagan, just one, in the province of Lanao del Norte, in central Mindanao, it illustrates the scale of the post-war influx of Christian migrants. There were 24 Christian settlers in the Kapatagan area in 1918. By 1941, the number has risen to 8,000. In 1960, there was a total of almost 100,000 immigrants. So just the detail of the demographics it seems to me important in all of the things we're discussing right now. In 1960, the population of central Mindanao, the area which saw the highest overall Christian immigration, soared from 0.7 million persons in 1948 to an estimated 2.3 million persons in 1970, representing a growth rate of 229%, as compared with the national figure of just 100%. All right, those are just two items in a timeline that's about 10 pages long. So the detail is staggering, if you really think about it. So I'll get out of the detail and go into a more macro, broad strokes. One of the things that I was quite surprised, I mean, I've been working in Mindanao for about 30 years, and I'm surprised that I did not know this. I only knew this in the last 4 years, that the Muslims gave land to the immigration. In the 1950s, through Lasadego, that's the land, that's the Ramon Magsaysay period land distribution and settlement scheme, Muslim families offered land and invited Christians into Mindanao. Now, this was quite a surprise to me. Now, I thought it was only in the town that I was working in. I didn't realize that big parts of Cotabato were actually given to the Lasadego for redistribution to Christian settlers. Now, the heartbreaking thing is that in the town that I was working in, after the Sultan Mamaho of that place went to the Medios Fortich, the woman in charge of resettlement, obviously from all indication, a rather thorough individual who did the resettlement program for Ramon Magsaysay as a particularly honest and thorough undertaking. The Sultan gave land, invited Christians to come in. Christians came in 1954. By 1964, 10 years later, the conflict between the Christian settlers had already erupted, mainly because the settlers from Panay, extremely poor people who were cooks during the Second World War, 17-year-old cooks, transferred to central Mindanao and eat a living, and were not about to give up their gains and would fight for their gains. already you can tell that by 1964 there was an incredible amount of resentment for the progress made by the settlers, which is all pretty understandable. But the heartbreaking part is by 1974, the Sultan who gave the land was a refugee because of Ilaga terror. And this is not one town. I thought that in the town that I was working in, this happened only in an isolated situation. But I find out that Congressman Mangansakan, whom some of you would know, gave lands of what are now the areas of near Mamasapano, huge for incredible numbers of Christian settlers, and Congressman Mangansakan became a refugee in the 1970s. So, things to think about, things unaccounted for in our storytelling. After 20 years, the conflict had obviously mutated into war. Now, war in particular was conducted on the part of the Philippine military, and I have a huge number of interviews with the military actors from that period, who were and still are believers in a military philosophy of civilian home defense. This is not something that they are ashamed of. This is something that they believe was correct. This is a Cold War military philosophy. I can't get into it here, but this is a conflict of worldview, because this was taught in military academies in the United States, from where our colonels and majors graduated. So the civilian home defense became the conduit for the so-called Ilaga era. Again, we must not, there is no moment or time for detail here, but some of you are aware that the civilian home defense forces became the home, the nest of human beings whose practices of terror included mutilation of Muslims and cannibalism, eating Muslim parts, body parts. Again, I have this on record. So you have a level 1 conflict conducted with powerful mythological elements. Ilaga was the term for rat, is obviously from a deeply symbolic layer, because when they arrived in Cotabato in 1950, 1952, 1953, rats consumed the first harvests of the settlement of the settlers. So rats are an incredibly important symbolic figure. And they became rats. They assumed the personality of rats. So the symbolic layer of this discussion is pretty staggering. So we now get to Mamasapano, and I'll end here. I doubt that it will be sufficiently understood if collective memory is not accounted for, and the collective memory are all different. The collective memory are memories. And I'll give an example of a recent conversation I had with a dear friend who is a good person, a political animal, who said that what brutality that this MILF or BIFF person who shot staff who were already dying in the head, and this should not be part of any conflict. And there was such self-righteousness about how brutal they are. And this human being, who's a good human being, does not know that Muslims were eaten and mutilated. And the mutilation and the eating, the cannibalism, is part of the collective memory of Muslims in Mindanao. And again, this total unknowing, indeed ignorance, is the vast emptiness in which the details of one incident is being discussed. So I'm hoping that with this forum, we could have a sense of what we don't know. what's unknown at the moment. But it's there. It's in the memory of people. It's in the symbolic order of people on the ground. So I'll leave it there. And just one note, the place itself, Liguasan Marsh, obviously is unknown to even the staff that came in during this planning. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marian.